The power company gave Nathan Rowe exactly 3 hours notice before cutting the electricity, which meant his 8-year-old son was eating cold cereal by flashlight when the final eviction notice slid under their apartment door. The paper landed face up, bold letters announcing that they had 72 hours to vacate or the sheriff would remove them physically, and Owen looked up from his bowl with the kind of resignation that no child should have mastered by 3rd grade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nathan picked up the notice with hands that had stopped shaking months ago, when shock had given way to grim acceptance that his life had become a series of emergencies he couldn't quite manage. The construction injury had destroyed his back and his income simultaneously, workers' comp had run out after 6 months, and his wife had left shortly after, taking their daughter but leaving Owen because, as she'd said, she could only handle saving one of them. "Are we going to be homeless?" Owen asked, his voice carrying the careful flatness of someone who'd learned that emotion made adults uncomfortable when they had no solutions to offer. "No," Nathan said, though he had no idea how to make that true. His bank account showed $17, his credit cards were maxed, and his truck had been repossessed last week. The apartment they were about to lose was the cheapest thing he could find, and even that had proven unsustainable on disability payments that covered about half of what survival actually cost. That afternoon, while Owen was at school, Nathan sat in the public library searching for options that didn't exist. Shelters were full, transitional housing had waiting lists measured in months, and the few people he might have asked for help had already been asked too many times. He was about to close the browser when an advertisement caught his attention, buried among rental listings he couldn't afford. County foreclosure auction, industrial property. Redfield Brick Works, 6. 2 acres including main kiln building and clay processing structures. Minimum bid $400. Property sold as is, extensive structural damage, buyer assumes all liabilities. The photographs showed a massive brick structure that looked like it belonged in another century, its smokestack rising against a gray sky like a monument to industry that had moved on and left the building behind. The brickwork sat on the outskirts of Ashton Grove, a town Nathan had driven through once, the kind of place where the peak had been sometime in the 1950s and everything since had been slow decline. According to county records, the Redfield Brickworks had been built in 1887 by a man named Silas Redfield, had operated for 90 years making clay bricks for construction projects throughout the region. It had closed in 1977 when concrete block became cheaper and brickmaking went industrial, had sat abandoned for decades accumulating tax liens and structural problems that made it unsellable through conventional means. The environmental reports mentioned potential lead contamination and asbestos concerns, remediation requirements that would cost more than Nathan would earn in a lifetime. The building was a liability disguised as property, the kind of thing no rational person would touch. But $440 with fees was less than 2 months' rent on an apartment he was being evicted from anyway, and a roof was a roof even if the walls beneath it were slowly crumbling. Nathan had stopped being rational around the time his back gave out and his wife walked away, had entered the territory of desperate gambits made by people who'd run out of conventional options. The auction happened the next morning in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and resignation, maybe 20 people scattered across folding chairs, most of them looking like investors or scrappers hoping to salvage equipment from industrial buildings. Nathan sat in the back with Owen, who'd insisted on coming after Nathan explained they might be bidding on a building that could become their home. The auctioneer worked through properties with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, selling vacant lots and condemned houses to buyers who knew exactly what they were acquiring. When the Redfield Brickworks came up, his voice took on a warning quality that suggested he was covering the county's liability more than promoting a sale. Property requires extensive structural assessment before occupation. Documented asbestos and potential lead contamination. Buyer assumes all environmental remediation costs. Multiple code violations. Minimum bid $400. Nathan raised his hand, his heart hammering so hard he thought the people in front of him could probably hear it. $400 from bidder 23. Do I hear $420? The room stayed silent. Nathan could feel people turning to look at him, could sense the judgment of those who recognized desperation when they saw it. Going once at 400. The auctioneer paused, scanning faces. Going twice. Nathan waited for reality to intervene, for someone to save him from his own desperation by outbidding him. Sold to bidder 23 for $400. Owen squeezed Nathan's hand hard enough to hurt. We bought a brick factory, Dad. Yeah, buddy, Nathan said, his voice not quite steady. We bought a brick factory. At the clerk's window, Nathan counted out $400 in 20s from money he'd been saving for security deposit on an apartment he could no longer afford, then added 40 more for processing and transfer fees. The clerk, a woman named Ruth who looked like she'd processed too many of these transactions to be surprised by anything, slid the deed across the counter with an expression that mixed sympathy with resignation. The Redfield place, she said, not quite a question. That building's been empty since before I started working here. Yes, ma'am. My grandfather worked there in the 40s. Said Silas Redfield was exacting but fair, paid better than most operations. Place had a reputation though. Ruth leaned forward slightly. Silas was secretive about certain parts of the operation, kept sections of the brickworks locked off from regular workers. Some people thought he was doing something illegal with the clay or the firing process. Others figured he was just protecting trade secrets. Is the building safe? For my son, I mean. Ruth's expression softened, seeing Owen waiting patiently by the door. Structurally, I honestly don't know. It hasn't been inspected in years, and the county condemned it for asbestos concerns back in the 90s. If you're planning to actually live there, you need to be very careful about which areas you use. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to the brickworks took them through Ashton Grove, a town that looked like it had been designed for twice as many people as currently live there. Empty storefronts lined Main Street, interspersed with struggling businesses and buildings that showed deferred maintenance. The kind of economic erosion Nathan recognized from other places he'd passed through, communities that had thrived when manufacturing was local and had slowly deflated when those jobs moved elsewhere. The brickworks sat at the edge of town where Quarry Road followed the ridge line above Ashton Creek. From the road, it looked almost majestic, a 4-story brick structure with industrial architecture that spoke to an era when buildings were constructed to last centuries. Up close, the decay was more evident. Broken windows, sections of roof that had clearly been leaking for years, walls showing the kind of weathering that came from decades without maintenance. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate hung open, its padlock long since cut away by salvagers or vandals. Nathan parked in the gravel lot where delivery trucks had once loaded finished bricks, looking at what he'd purchased with money that should have kept them housed for another month. It's really big, Owen said, his voice mixing all with uncertainty. It is. Probably too big for us to use most of it. But we'll find a space that's safe, make it work until we figure out what comes next. They approached the main entrance carefully, stepping over broken bricks and around rusted equipment that had been abandoned in the yard. The door was secured with a newer-looking padlock, and the key Ruth had given Nathan turned smoothly despite the building's decay. Inside, the brickworks opened into a vast space that took Nathan's breath away. The main production floor stretched out like a cathedral to industry, 3 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by iron beams and brick arches. Massive kilns dominated the far wall, the furnaces where raw clay had been transformed into finished brick through heat and time. Equipment filled the space, clay mixers, brick presses, curing racks, all of it frozen in the positions they'd occupied when the last shift had ended sometime in 1977. The smell was distinct, a combination of old clay dust and mildew and something mineral that had soaked into the building's bones over 90 years of operation. Not unpleasant exactly, but deeply unfamiliar, the scent of processes most of the modern world had forgotten. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Owen stayed close to Nathan, both of them processing the scale of what they'd committed to. There's stairs, Owen said, pointing to a metal staircase that climbed to the second level. We'll check them carefully. Buildings this old, you can't trust everything is still safe. They climbed slowly, Nathan testing each step before letting Owen follow. The second floor held what appeared to be administrative offices and storage rooms, spaces where the business side of brickmaking had happened while production work went on below. Most of the rooms were empty except for debris and water damage from the leaking roof. One office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking both the production floor and the creek valley beyond. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but still intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most of them hanging open and empty. A photograph hung crooked on the wall, showing a stern-looking man in work clothes standing in front of the brickworks sometime in what looked like the 1960s. "Is that Mr. Redfield?" Owen asked. Nathan examined the photograph more closely. Silas Redfield had the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands, his expression serious, his posture suggesting pride in the operation behind him. The photograph showed the brickworks in its prime, before abandonment had claimed it. As Nathan studied the wall where the photograph hung, he noticed something odd. The office's dimensions didn't quite match what they should be based on the building's exterior. The wall behind the filing cabinets seemed too close, leaving a gap of maybe 8 feet unaccounted for. He started pulling filing cabinets away from the wall, their metal frames scraping across the floor with sounds that echoed through the empty building. Behind the third cabinet, he found what he was looking for, a door frame that had been covered over with paneling, disguised so thoroughly that you'd never notice it unless you were specifically looking. "Dad, what is that?" Owen's voice carried curiosity rather than fear. Nathan ran his fingers along the edge of the covered door frame, feeling the seams. This wasn't casual boarding up. This had been deliberate concealment, the kind of thing done by someone who wanted a door to be completely forgotten. The paneling came away with effort, revealing beneath it a heavy wooden door with an old-fashioned lock. The keys Ruth had given him included several that looked original to the building rather than modern additions. The second key turned in the lock with resistance that suggested decades of disuse. Nathan pulled the door open carefully, revealing darkness and a narrow staircase descending into the building's foundation. Cool air rose from below, carrying a smell different from the brickworks' clay and mildew. Something metallic and almost clean, like air that had been sealed away from the decay happening in the rest of the structure. Nathan pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam revealed stone steps leading down approximately 20 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger space below. "I want to come," Owen said when Nathan started to tell him to wait. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. They'd survived everything else together, his injury, his wife's abandonment, months of grinding poverty that had stripped away everything except each other. Whatever waited below, they'd face it together. They descended carefully, the stone steps solid despite their age. The stairs ended in a chamber approximately 30 feet square, the walls lined with brick, the ceiling supported by stone vaults that suggested serious engineering. Unlike the brickworks above, this space showed no signs of water damage or decay. It had been sealed so completely that time had barely touched it. Wooden shelving lined 2 walls, and on those shelves sat ledgers, dozens of them, each one labeled with dates ranging from 1887 through 1977. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made Nathan's breath catch and his grip on Owen's shoulder tighten. A large iron safe, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, sat on a platform of stone blocks. Unlike everything else in the brickworks, the safe showed signs of maintenance, its surface oiled and preserved. A brass plate was affixed to its front, engraved with words Nathan had to step closer to read. "Silas Redfield, Master Brickmaker. Clay transforms through fire, as fortunes transform through patience." Owen pressed against Nathan's side, his small hand gripping his father's jacket. "Dad, is that a treasure chest?" "I don't know what it is," Nathan said honestly, though his heart was racing with possibilities he didn't dare name. "But we need to be very careful about this." He examined the safe more closely, finding it had both a combination lock and a keyhole. None of the keys Ruth had given him seemed to match the lock, and he had no combination. But as he played his flashlight around the chamber, he noticed something else, a ledger sitting by itself on a small table, newer looking than the others, with a note tucked into its cover. Nathan opened the note carefully, finding handwritten text in fading ink. To whoever discovers this chamber, the combination is the year this brickworks was founded, followed by the year I was born. The key is hidden where all good brick begins, in the clay bed itself, beneath the oldest willow that has marked this land since before my time. If you found this place, you've earned what it protects. Use it more wisely than I managed. Silas Redfield, 1977. Nathan stood in the hidden chamber holding a note written by a dead man, looking at a safe that might contain nothing or might contain something that could change everything, feeling the weight of discovery settle onto shoulders that were already carrying more than they could bear. Above them, the brickworks creaked in the wind, its vast spaces holding secrets Silas Redfield had died protecting. The building Nathan had purchased for $440 of money he couldn't spare had just revealed itself to be something far more complicated than an abandoned industrial ruin. And whatever waited in that safe, whatever Silas Redfield had sealed away in 1977, was about to become Nathan and Owen's burden to carry forward or their salvation from circumstances that had been grinding them down for 2 years. The chamber waited in silence, its secrets kept for nearly 50 years, patient as only the buried things can be. Nathan's first instinct was to try the combination immediately, but something about Silas Redfield's note made him pause. The man had been deliberate, had created a puzzle that required both knowledge and physical effort to solve. Opening the safe without finding the key felt like cheating a test he didn't fully understand yet. "We need to find the willow tree first," he told Owen. "Before we try anything else." They climbed back up to the office level, Nathan's mind racing through implications he was trying not to count on. Silas Redfield had been wealthy enough to own and operate a successful brickworks, had died under circumstances that apparently left this chamber undiscovered for nearly 50 years. The safe could contain business records or personal papers. Or it could contain something that changed everything for a man who currently had $17.72 until eviction from an apartment he no longer owned. Outside, the November afternoon was fading toward evening, clouds gathering with the promise of rain. The brickworks property extended beyond the main building to include what had been clay extraction areas, now overgrown with decades of neglect. A creek marked the eastern boundary, and along its bank, willows grew in a regular line. Nathan studied the trees, looking for the oldest. Most were relatively young, probably self-seeded after the brickworks closed, but one massive willow stood apart from the others, its trunk easily 5 feet in diameter, its drooping branches creating a canopy that would have provided shade when Silas Redfield still walked this land. "That one," Owen said, pointing to the same tree Nathan had identified. They approached it carefully, Nathan scanning the ground around its base for anything that looked deliberate. The soil was softer here, influenced by the creek's moisture, covered with years of fallen leaves. But near the trunk's south side, where roots twisted above ground like arthritic fingers, he found something that made his pulse quicken. A small metal box, maybe a foot square, had been embedded among the roots and sealed with wax that had cracked with age but had apparently done its job keeping moisture out. Nathan pried it loose, feeling the weight of something substantial inside. The box opened to reveal a key wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved after nearly 50 years buried in clay soil. The key was ornate, old-fashioned, the kind made for locks built to outlast the people who commissioned them. Tucked beneath it was a piece of paper, protected by the oilcloth, with a single line in Silas's handwriting: "The earth keeps what's entrusted to it, and yields it to those patient enough to search." Owen watched with the focused intensity of a child who understood they were participating in something significant. Mr. Redfield really didn't want anyone to find this unless they looked everywhere. No, he didn't. Nathan pocketed the key, looking back at the brickworks that loomed against the darkening sky. Which means whatever's in that safe, he believed it was worth protecting this way. They were halfway back to the building when a truck pulled into the gravel lot, newer and cleaner than anything that belonged in this part of Ashton Grove. 2 men got out, both wearing work clothes that were too pristine, their posture suggesting they weren't here for friendly conversation. Nathan put himself between them and Owen instinctively, his phone already in his hand. "Can I help you?" The older man stepped forward, maybe 60, with the kind of face that came from years of getting what he wanted through intimidation backed by money. "You're the one who bought this place at auction." "I am. Name's Charles Wickham. This is my nephew Derek. We've got a proposition that'll save you a lot of trouble." Nathan kept his voice neutral. "I just bought the property yesterday. Haven't even had time to assess what I'm dealing with. That's exactly why we're here." Charles pulled out folded papers from his jacket. "We're prepared to buy the brickworks from you. $30,000, transfer happens within 2 weeks. You walk away with a profit and don't have to deal with environmental cleanup or structural problems that'll bankrupt you." $30,000. A year ago, that would have seemed like salvation. Even now, it represented security Nathan hadn't had since before his injury. But the timing was too convenient, the offer too immediate. These men had been waiting for someone to buy the brickworks at auction, had come prepared with an offer that suggested they knew something about the property's actual value. "Why do you want it?" Nathan asked. "Investment opportunity. The land itself is valuable, creek frontage, proximity to town. The building needs to be demolished, but what's underneath is worth developing. And you're offering $30,000 for property you plan to demolish?" Charles's expression hardened slightly. "We're offering fair value for property with massive liabilities. The asbestos remediation alone will cost you 6 figures. The building's structurally unsound. You're in over your head, and we're giving you a way out that leaves you substantially better off than you were yesterday." Derek spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge his uncle's didn't. People who refuse reasonable offers sometimes find things getting complicated. Small towns have ways of making life difficult for outsiders who don't understand how things work. Nathan felt Owen press against his back, small hands gripping his jacket. The threat was barely veiled, the kind of pressure applied by people who were used to getting what they wanted through intimidation when money didn't work fast enough. "I need to think about it," Nathan said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "You've got 48 hours. Charles handed him the papers. "After that, the offer expires and you're on your own with all the problems this place brings." After they left, Nathan stood in the gravel lot holding an offer for money he desperately needed, knowing that accepting it meant surrendering whatever Silas Redfield had hidden in that chamber. The Wickham family had been waiting for someone to buy the brickworks, had come prepared to pressure a quick sale, which meant they knew or suspected something about what the building contained. "Are we going to sell?" Owen asked quietly. "I don't know yet. But we're not deciding until we know what we actually have." That night, they camped in the brickworks' least damaged office space, using sleeping bags Nathan had kept from better days and a camping stove to heat soup. It wasn't comfortable, probably violated every safety regulation that existed, but it was shelter when the alternative was sleeping in an apartment they'd been legally barred from occupying. After Owen fell asleep, Nathan sat in the darkness thinking about the combination Silas Redfield had left. The year the brickworks was founded, 1887, followed by Silas's birth year. He didn't know Silas's birth year, but Ruth at the courthouse might, or the obituary from 1977 would contain that information. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the safe and what it might contain and whether the Wickhams' offer was legitimate or whether they were trying to steal something valuable from someone too desperate to fight back. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and descended to the hidden chamber alone, his phone's flashlight illuminating the space Silas Redfield had sealed away. The ledgers on the shelves represented 90 years of meticulous record-keeping, each one documenting brick production with the kind of detail that suggested pride and precision. Nathan pulled one from the early 1900s, finding page after page of orders and specifications, notes about clay quality and firing temperatures, a business run with exacting standards. He found Silas's birth year in a ledger from 1901, March 7, 1901, son of Marcus Redfield, born into the business that would define his life. Which meant the combination was 1887 to 1901. Nathan stood before the safe, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the dial. Right to 18, left to 87, right to 19, left to 01. The lock mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness, suggesting Silas had maintained it even as the rest of the brickworks decayed. Nathan inserted the key he'd found beneath the willow tree, and it turned with the same well-oiled precision. The safe door swung open, revealing contents that made Nathan's breath stop completely. Not business records or personal papers or anything he'd half expected. Instead, stacked neatly on the safe's shelves, were gold bars. Actual gold bars, maybe 50 of them, each one stamped with assayer marks and weight specifications. Nathan pulled one out with shaking hands. The bar was heavy, maybe 2 pounds, marked as 24-karat gold with a date of 1976. He counted bars, his mind struggling with mathematics that seemed impossible. 50 bars, roughly 2 pounds each, at current gold prices that he vaguely remembered being around $2,000 per ounce. Over $3 million, give or take. Possibly more. Silas Redfield had converted his entire operation to gold before closing, had hidden it in his chamber, and had died before retrieving it or telling anyone where it was. For nearly 50 years, a fortune in precious metal had sat beneath a building nobody wanted, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed brickworks at auction. Nathan sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by more wealth than he'd earned in 50 lifetimes of construction work, trying to process what this meant. The Wickhams knew. Or suspected. Their $30,000 offer was an insult if they knew what was actually hidden here, or it was a gamble if they only suspected and wanted to acquire the property to search properly. But the gold was legally his. The property transfer had been legitimate, and anything contained on the property belonged to the new owner unless specifically excluded. Silas's note had been clear, to whoever discovers this chamber, which meant it had been intended as inheritance for someone, even if Silas hadn't known who. Dawn found Nathan still in the chamber, having examined every bar, having read through more of Silas's ledgers looking for context. The story that emerged was of a man who'd seen his industry dying, who'd liquidated his operation systematically over several years, converting equipment and inventory and business assets to gold as a hedge against economic uncertainty he'd seen coming. The ledgers from 1974 to 1977 showed Silas preparing for closure, paying off debts, settling with employees, methodically dismantling a business his family had run for 90 years. The final entry, dated February 1977, simply read, "The kill's cool. The provision endures. May it find hands that build rather than destroy." Nathan climbed back to the office level as morning light filtered through broken windows, finding Owen awake and eating a granola bar from their dwindling supplies. His son took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You opened it." "Yeah." "What was inside?" Nathan sat beside him, choosing honesty because Owen had earned it through everything they'd survived together. "Gold. A lot of gold. More than I can really understand right now." Owen's eyes widened. "Like how much?" "Enough that we never have to worry about rent or food or whether I can afford medicine for my back. Enough that you can go to any college you want someday. Enough that everything changes." Owen was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the seriousness he applied to important things. "But the men yesterday, they want to buy the brickworks because they know about the gold." "I think so, yeah. Or they suspect." "So what do we do?" It was the question Nathan had been asking himself since opening the safe. The practical answer was to take the gold, sell the property to the Wickhams for their $30,000, and disappear before anyone realized what had been found. But Silas's note echoed in his mind, "Use it more wisely than I managed." "I need to talk to someone who knew Silas Redfield," Nathan said. "Understand why he did this, what he was protecting the gold for. Then we decide." Ruth at the courthouse gave him a name, Vernon Bailey, who'd been Silas's foreman for 30 years and still lived in Ashton Grove. Nathan found him in a small house near the creek, a man in his 80s with sharp eyes and clear memories of the man who'd employed him. Silas was complicated, Vernon said after Nathan explained he'd purchased the brickworks. Brilliant at his craft, terrible at accepting that the world had moved on. The brickworks was his life, and when it became clear traditional brickmaking couldn't compete with industrial production, it broke something in him. He converted everything to gold before closing. Do you know why? Vernon's expression grew guarded. There were rumors. Silas didn't trust banks or paper money, believed in tangible assets you could hold and control. He'd seen the Depression's aftermath even though he was too young to remember it personally. Believed gold was the only real security. Did he leave a family? Anyone who might have a claim to what he left behind? No children, never married. His brother died in Korea, parents went before the brickworks closed. Silas was the last Redfield, and he died alone in that building. Vernon paused. Did you find something? Nathan made a decision to trust him. A hidden chamber. A safe. A lot of gold that Silas left with a note saying whoever found it should use it more wisely than he did. Vernon's eyes glistened. He did it then. He actually managed to hide his life savings where those vultures couldn't find it. What vultures? The Wickham family. Charles's father was pressuring Silas to sell in the 70s, wanted the land for development. Silas refused, said the brickworks represented something that mattered more than profit. When Silas died, the Wickhams tried to buy the property from the county, but the environmental liens made it too complicated. Vernon leaned forward. Charles has been waiting 40 years for that property to go to foreclosure, for someone desperate enough to buy it who he could pressure into a quick resale. He offered me $30,000 yesterday. Which tells you he suspects what's there but hasn't found it himself. Silas's death was ruled accidental, fell from a catwalk while working alone. But there were always questions. He was careful and experienced. Some people thought he was murdered, that someone tried to force him to reveal where he'd hidden his gold. The implications chilled Nathan. And you think that someone was connected to the Wickham family? I think Silas died protecting something he believed mattered. The gold, yes, but also the principle that his life's work shouldn't be stolen by people who only saw land value where he saw legacy. Vernon's expression was fierce despite his age. If you found what Silas hid, you've inherited more than gold. You've inherited a fight he died fighting. After leaving Vernon's house, Nathan drove back to the brickworks with Owen beside him, his mind churning through impossible decisions. The gold could change their lives, but it also made them targets for people who'd been waiting decades to acquire what Silas had hidden. Selling to the Wickhams would be the safe choice, but it would mean surrendering to exactly the kind of pressure Silas had resisted. They found Charles Wickham waiting at the brickworks, his nephew Derek and 2 other men with him. Not a friendly visit. Charles's expression was harder than yesterday, his patience apparently exhausted. Time's up for nice offers, Charles said. We know you found something. Property records show you spent an unusual amount of time here yesterday, and you've been asking questions around town about Silas Redfield. You're going to sell us this property for what we offered, or you're going to discover how unpleasant life gets for people who don't cooperate. Nathan felt Owen press against him, felt the weight of Silas Redfield's legacy and his own son's future pulling in different directions. The property's legally mine. Whatever I found is legally mine. You can make threats all you want, but I haven't broken any laws. Derek stepped forward, his posture aggressive. You think the law matters in Ashton Grove? My family employs half this town, owns most of the real estate, sits on every board that counts. We can make you wish you'd never heard of this brickworks. Can you? Nathan pulled out his phone, showing the recording he'd started when he saw their trucks in the lot. Because threatening someone on camera, admitting to planning harassment, that seems like the kind of thing state police might find interesting. And I've got documentation of everything I found, photographs time-stamped and uploaded to cloud storage. Anything happens to me or my son, it all goes public. Charles's face darkened, but he took a step back, recalculating. You're making a mistake. That gold isn't yours by right. Silas Redfield didn't report his asset conversions properly, was hiding wealth from taxation. You keep it, you're complicit in tax evasion. Silas's ledgers show every transaction, every asset sale, everything documented and taxed appropriately. He converted a legitimate business to gold, which is unusual but not illegal. Nathan kept his voice steady despite his hammering heart. but if you want to claim otherwise, do it through proper legal channels. Until then, stay off my property." After they left, Nathan stood shaking with adrenaline and fear, knowing he'd just made enemies of people who'd been waiting 40 years to get what he'd found. Owen hugged him tightly, his small frame trembling. "Are we safe?" Owen asked. "For now. The recording gives us leverage, and they know I've documented everything. They can't just take what they want without risking exposure." Nathan knelt to meet his son's eyes. "But we need to be smart about this. Secure the gold somewhere safe, get legal advice, make sure we're protected." That night, after moving half the gold bars to a safety deposit box in the next county and photographing everything that remained for documentation, after consulting with a lawyer who confirmed that found property transferred with legitimate property ownership, after installing security cameras around the brickworks, Nathan sat with Owen in their makeshift living space. "Silas Redfield died protecting this," he said. "Not just the gold, but the principle that some things are worth standing for even when powerful people want to take them. I think about that, about whether I'm strong enough to do what he did." Owen was quiet for a moment, then said something that cut through all his uncertainty. "Mom left us because things got hard. She chose the easy path and took Emma but left me behind. You're choosing to stand for something even though it's scary. That's the difference between her and you." Nathan pulled his son close, feeling the weight of his trust and the burden of the choice he was making. The gold could buy them security, but keeping it meant fighting people who had resources and patience and 40 years of anger driving them. Silas Redfield had fought that fight alone and had died for it. But Nathan wasn't alone. He had Owen, had legal documentation, had evidence of the Wickhams' threats and intentions. He had the truth about Silas's legitimate business practices, had a community that remembered the brickworks' better days, had the law on his side if he was brave enough to invoke it. The brickwork stood in the darkness, its walls holding secrets that had finally been revealed, its foundations solid despite decades of neglect. Nathan had bought it for $440 because he was desperate and had nowhere else to go. Now it had given him something Silas Redfield had believed was worth dying to protect, not just gold, but the principle that some inheritances came with obligations that extended beyond personal benefit. The fight wasn't over. The Wickhams would regroup, would find new ways to pressure and threaten, would make life difficult in the ways small-town power could make things difficult. But Nathan had faced hardship before, had survived his wife's abandonment and financial ruin and the slow erosion of everything he'd thought was stable. This fight, at least, was for something that mattered. For Owen's future, for Silas Redfield's legacy, for the principle that desperate people who stumbled into good fortune deserved the chance to keep it if they were brave enough to stand their ground. The brickworks waited, patient as only old buildings can be, ready to shelter the next chapter of a story that had started in 1887 and had just found its latest unlikely inheritor in a man who'd had nothing left to lose except the ground he stood on. The lawyer's name was David Chen, and he'd been practicing in the county for 20 years, long enough to know the Wickham family's methods. He reviewed Nathan's documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered when powerful people wanted something you had. Silas Redfield's estate was settled in 1978, David said, spreading papers across his desk. All debts paid, all taxes current at the time of his death. The gold you found was his personal assets, legally acquired through the documented sale of business equipment and inventory. The fact that he chose to convert to gold rather than keep cash is unusual but entirely legal. Nathan felt some of the tension in his chest ease. So the Wickhams can't claim it was hidden to avoid taxes? They can claim whatever they want, but the burden of proof would be on them. Silas's ledgers show meticulous record-keeping, including proper reporting of all asset sales. Unless they can prove otherwise, the gold is yours as part of the property transfer. David leaned back in his chair. However, there's a complication you need to understand. Nathan waited, familiar enough with complications to know they rarely came alone. The environmental cleanup requirements are real. The county has authority to condemn the property if remediation isn't begun within a certain time frame. That gives the Wickhams leverage. They could pressure the county to accelerate that timeline, force you into a position where you can't afford cleanup and have to sell. How much would proper remediation cost? Conservatively, $300,000, possibly more depending on asbestos extent and any lead contamination in the clay processing areas. The gold you found would cover it many times over, but you'd be investing a substantial portion of your windfall into a property that may have limited commercial value afterward. Nathan thought about this, about the irony of finding $3 million only to have to spend a tenth of it making the building that contained it safe. But he also thought about Silas Redfield spending 90 years building something that mattered, about the principle of not letting the Wickhams take what they hadn't earned. What if I did the cleanup properly? What leverage would they have then? David smiled slightly. None, legally. If you remediate the environmental issues and bring the building up to code, the property is yours free and clear. They'd have to give up or find another angle, and I'll be watching to make sure any new pressure stays within legal bounds. Over the next 4 months, Nathan learned more about asbestos abatement and lead remediation than he'd ever wanted to know. He hired specialists who assessed the contamination, developed cleanup plans, and began the slow work of making the brickwork safe. The process was expensive and tedious, but it was also transformative. Watching the building shed its toxic legacy felt like participating in something larger than himself. Owen adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of children who'd learned to expect change. He enrolled in Ashton Grove Elementary, made friends with the ease that came from having stopped being afraid of temporary connections. The gold meant Nathan could afford proper housing, but Owen insisted they stay at the brickworks, camping in increasingly comfortable sections as Nathan made each area safe and livable. "This is our place," Owen said when Nathan suggested renting something temporary. "We found Mr. Redfield's treasure together. We should stay where it happened." The community's response to their presence evolved slowly. Some people remembered Silas Redfield fondly, were glad to see the brickworks occupied again. Others were loyal to the Wickham family and treated Nathan with suspicion. The divide revealed itself in small ways: which businesses served him readily, which suddenly had reasons why they couldn't help with various needs. Vernon Bailey became an unexpected ally, connecting Nathan with people who'd worked at the brickworks and wanted to see it honored rather than demolished. They shared stories about Silas, about his exacting standards and fair treatment of workers, about a man who'd believed buildings like this mattered beyond their economic value. "Taught me more about quality work in 5 years than I learned anywhere else," Vernon said, helping Nathan catalog equipment that might be worth preserving. Silas never cut corners, never compromised standards even when cheaper methods would have been more profitable. The brickworks closed because he refused to adapt, but everything it made was built to last centuries. Through Vernon, Nathan learned more about Silas's final years. The man had become increasingly isolated as his industry died, had refused to modernize or accept that traditional brickmaking was becoming obsolete, had chosen to close his operation rather than compromise the quality that had defined his work. He died alone in the building he loved, and whether that death was accident or something darker remained a question local people debated quietly. The environmental cleanup took 8 months and cost $370,000. Nathan watched his fortune diminish with each payment, investing Silas's hidden gold back into the building that had held it. But as contaminated materials were removed and replaced, as testing showed the property returning to safe levels, he felt something shift. This wasn't just spending money, it was honoring a trust Silas had placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. Charles Wickham tried one more approach in June, appearing at the brickworks on a summer morning when Nathan was overseeing the final remediation work. His posture was different this time, less aggressive and more defeated, the stance of a man who'd been fighting too long for something he was starting to question. "The cleanup's almost done," Charles said, "not quite a question. Should be certified clear next week. Then you'll have a clean property with no environmental liens. Quite an accomplishment for someone who bought it for $400 at auction." Nathan didn't respond, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. "My father spent his life trying to acquire this land. Told me stories about how Silas Redfield refused fair offers, how the brickwork should have been ours to develop. I believed him, made it my mission to finish what he started." Charles looked at the building with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read. But my daughter asked me last week why I was so obsessed with a building some old man died in 40 years ago. And I realized I didn't have a good answer beyond because my father wanted it. Why tell me this? Because Derek is starting to talk the same way my father did, making the brickworks into some kind of symbol that was stolen from us. I see the same obsession taking root in him, and I'm tired of it. Charles met Nathan's eyes. I'm withdrawing our interest in this property. No more pressure, no more threats. You won the fight fair, and my nephew needs to learn that some battles cost more than they're worth. After Charles left, Nathan stood in the brickworks yard trying to process the strange victory. He'd prepared for continued conflict, for legal battles and escalating pressure. The sudden absence of threat felt disorienting, like tensing for impact that never came. Vernon visited that afternoon, his eyes bright with something approaching vindication. Charles Wickham came to see me last week. Asked about Silas, about what kind of man he'd really been. I think he finally started questioning the stories his father told him. What did you tell him? The truth. That Silas was difficult and stubborn, but honest. That he closed his business rather than compromise quality or sell to people he didn't respect. That he died protecting something he believed mattered, not just gold, but principles about craft and refusing to surrender to people who only saw profit where he saw legacy. Vernon pulled an envelope from his pocket. I also have something for you. Silas gave this to me in early 1977, said if anyone ever found his hidden chamber, I should give it to them. I've been holding it for 47 years, wondering if this day would come. The envelope was sealed with wax, Silas's initials pressed into it. Inside was a letter written in the same precise hand as the note Nathan had found in the chamber. To the finder of my provision, if you're reading this, you've demonstrated the kind of thoroughness and persistence that I valued in my work. You found the hidden door that others missed, solved the puzzle I left, claimed what I couldn't bear to entrust to institutions I didn't trust. The gold represents 90 years of careful work, of refusing to compromise quality for profit, of building something that mattered even when the market moved toward cheaper alternatives. I converted it to gold because I believed in tangible assets, in wealth that couldn't be devalued by governments or banks, in security you could hold in your hands. But gold alone isn't the inheritance I'm leaving. The real value is in understanding why I did this, why I chose to hide my life's earnings rather than surrender them to people who'd use them to erase what I built. The brickworks represents an era of craftsmanship that's disappearing, of work done with precision and pride and attention to detail that modern production doesn't value. If you're using this gold wisely, you're not just enriching yourself. You're honoring a principle that some things matter more than profit, that buildings and skills and ways of working deserve protection even when they're no longer economically optimal. Keep the brickworks if you can. Preserve what I built if it's possible. Or at minimum, ensure that whatever replaces it respects the fact that this place represented something beyond simple commerce. I'm dying as I write this, not physically yet but in the way that matters. My life's work is becoming obsolete, my skills irrelevant, my building increasingly empty of purpose. The gold is my final act of defiance against that obsolescence, my way of ensuring that at least some value persists even after the craft itself dies. Use it better than I did. I hoarded it when I should have invested it in teaching others, in preserving the knowledge that dies with my generation. Learn from my mistake. Whatever you do with this inheritance, let it build something rather than simply hide something. Silas Redfield, January 1977. Nathan read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of Silas's trust settle onto shoulders that were stronger now than when he'd arrived in Ashton Grove. The gold had saved him from immediate desperation, but Silas's real gift was the understanding that inheritance came with obligation, not legal obligation, but moral imperative to honor the trust placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. That evening, after Owen had gone to bed in the bedroom Nathan had built in the safest section of the brickworks, he sat in Silas's old office thinking about what to build with the gold that remained. The environmental cleanup had consumed a significant portion, but over $2.5 million still represented security beyond anything he'd imagined 8 months ago. He could sell the brickworks now, walk away with the remaining gold and start fresh somewhere else. The building had served its purpose, had sheltered them and yielded its treasure. But Silas's letter echoed in his mind, "Use it better than I did." Over the next year, Nathan began transforming the brickworks with the same methodical care Silas had applied to his craft. He hired local contractors, people who remembered the building's working days and wanted to see it honored rather than demolished. They repaired the roof section by section, replaced broken windows with period-appropriate materials, reinforced the structure while preserving its industrial character. The work was slow and deliberate, motivated not by profit but by the principle Silas had died protecting. Nathan documented everything, photographing the restoration process, researching brickmaking history to understand what the building had been designed for. Owen helped, his interest in the project deepening as he learned about the craft that had filled these spaces. Did they really make all the bricks by hand? Owen asked one evening while examining molds Nathan had found and restored. In the early days, yeah. Later they had machines that pressed the clay, but someone still had to monitor quality, adjust firing temperatures, ensure every brick met standards. Nathan showed him one of the ledgers from the 1920s, orders for specific brick types with detailed specifications. Silas took pride in precision. Buildings all over this region were constructed with Redfield bricks because they lasted. Could we make bricks again? The old way? The question surprised Nathan, opened possibilities he hadn't considered. I don't know how. Silas's skills died with him. But Owen's enthusiasm planted a seed. Nathan started researching traditional brickmaking, finding that while industrial production had replaced most artisanal methods, there was growing interest in heritage craft techniques and sustainable building materials. There were people who still practiced traditional methods, who taught them, who believed handmade bricks had qualities mass-produced versions couldn't replicate. He found Sarah Martinez, a master brick maker in Vermont who'd learned traditional firing techniques from one of the last artisans. Sarah visited the brickworks in the fall, her eyes lighting up when she saw the equipment Silas had left behind. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said, examining the kilns that Nathan had carefully preserved. "Most facilities like this were demolished decades ago. You've got infrastructure here that could be adapted for traditional brickmaking, could train people in methods that are nearly extinct. You'd be willing to teach that?" "I've been looking for a permanent facility where I could train apprentices, preserve knowledge before my generation takes it to the grave like Silas did." Sarah paused. "If you're serious about this, about honoring what this building represented, I'd be interested in partnering. Use your space, share the knowledge, create something that connects traditional craft to modern needs." The partnership formed slowly, carefully, built on shared understanding that this was about more than profit. Sarah moved to Ashton Grove the following spring, bringing equipment and expertise. They converted sections of the brickworks to small-scale artisanal production, sustainable processes that honored Silas's standards while serving contemporary markets. The teaching component evolved naturally. Craftspeople started coming to learn, drawn by the rare opportunity to study traditional brickmaking in a facility designed for it. Owen, now 10, became Sarah's informal assistant, learning techniques that connected him to something Silas Redfield had understood, that some knowledge was worth preserving even when the world had moved on. 18 months after Nathan had bought the brickworks for $440, they held a small celebration marking the building's transformation. Local people came, some who'd worked there under Silas, others who'd watched it decay and were glad to see it alive again. Even Charles Wickham attended, accompanied by his daughter Emily, both wearing expressions of complicated acceptance. "My father would hate this," Charles said, watching demonstrations of traditional brickmaking. "He wanted this land for commercial development, something profitable by his standards. But watching what you've built, I think maybe Silas knew what he was doing when he hid that gold." Emily was quieter, studying the restored equipment and the craftspeople learning skills her grandfather had dismissed as obsolete. "We wasted decades fighting over this. Time we could have spent building something that mattered instead of just trying to tear down what someone else built." After the celebration, Nathan and Owen stood on the second-floor catwalk where Silas had fallen to his death, looking down at the brickworks floor that now held activity and purpose again. The building breathed differently than it had when Nathan first entered, no longer abandoned but alive, serving a function Silas would have recognized even if the specifics had evolved. "Do you think Mr. Redfield knew someone like us would find his treasure?" Owen asked. "I think he hoped. He created the puzzle, left the clues, trusted that whoever was desperate enough to buy a foreclosed brickworks would be thorough enough to find what he'd hidden." Nathan put his arm around his son's shoulders. "He gave us more than gold. He gave us purpose, something to build that's bigger than just ourselves." The years continued their steady progression. The brickworks became known among craftspeople, a rare facility where traditional skills were taught and preserved. The business wasn't hugely profitable, but it was sustainable, employed local people, drew visitors who spent money in Ashton Grove and helped stabilize a town that had been slowly dying. Owen flourished in ways Nathan could never have predicted when they'd arrived desperate and displaced. He became skilled in traditional brickmaking, developed a reputation for quality work that honored Silas's standards. He talked about studying materials engineering in college, about finding ways to bridge traditional craft with modern sustainability, about keeping the brickworks operating while expanding its mission. Nathan had used the remainder of Silas's gold carefully, investing in the building's restoration and the teaching programs, living modestly despite wealth that would have allowed luxury. He'd found purpose in the work, in preserving something Silas had believed was worth dying to protect, in giving Owen a foundation that went beyond financial security. Vernon Bailey died peacefully at 87, his last words to Nathan a reminder that Silas would have been proud. "You understood what he was trying to preserve. Not just a building or money, but principles about craft and quality and refusing to surrender when powerful people demand it." On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after buying the brickworks at auction, Nathan sat in Silas's restored office reading through the ledgers that documented a century of brickmaking. The entries ended abruptly in February 1977, Silas's final notation about cooling kills and enduring provision, the last words of a man preparing to hide his life's earnings in a chamber he might not live to open. But the story hadn't ended there. It had continued through Nathan's desperate purchase, through Owen's discovery of the hidden door, through the choice to stand rather than sell, through years of careful restoration and teaching and preservation. Silas's legacy hadn't died when he fell from that catwalk. It had waited, patient as only buried things can be, for someone worthy to claim it. The brickworks stood solid in the evening light, its walls holding stories that spanned generations, its spaces filled with the sound of craft being practiced and taught. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through stubbornness and vision and the kind of courage that came from having nothing to lose except principles you refused to surrender. Nathan thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about a hidden chamber and a dead man's trust, about choices made and ground held. He thought about Silas dying alone, protecting treasure and principle in equal measure, trusting that eventually someone would come along who'd understand why it mattered. That someone had been him, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen the easier path of selling and walking away. But Owen had helped him see what Silas had seen, that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit, that true wealth lay in building something that honored the trust placed in you. The land kept its secrets still, the creek flowing past the brickworks as it had for millennia, the willow tree standing where Silas had buried his key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had also given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful, and people stubborn enough to do the building. As darkness settled over Ashton Grove and the brickworks lights glowed warm against the night, Nathan felt the weight of 5 years settle into something approaching peace. Not satisfaction exactly, because there was always more work to do, always knowledge to preserve and skills to teach. But contentment with choices made and ground held, with a son who'd found purpose in a building that had found new life. Silas Redfield's treasure had saved them from immediate desperation, but his real gift was understanding that inheritance meant more than receiving, it meant choosing to honor what had been entrusted to you, to build rather than simply consume, to preserve what deserved preservation even when the world had moved on to easier alternatives. The brickworks would stand long after Nathan was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you own but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect and pass forward. Nathan stood in Silas's office, holding ledgers that documented a life of careful work, feeling the continuity between that life and his own. The gold had been spent wisely, invested in restoration and teaching, used better than Silas had managed. The building breathed with purpose, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its spaces filled with people learning skills that would have died without this preservation. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and clay, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear. Silas had held this ground until it could be passed to someone who'd understand. Nathan had held it until Owen could claim it as his own heritage. Owen would hold it for whoever came next, creating continuity that transformed individual struggle into something larger than any one life. The brickwork stood as proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes desperate gambles made by broken people led to places nobody could have predicted but everyone could recognize as right. 10 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the brickworks the way water shapes clay. Nathan watched Owen grow from the 8-year-old boy who'd helped him find Silas Redfield's hidden chamber to an 18-year-old young man whose hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent a decade learning traditional brick craft. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you notice day by day, but when Nathan looked at photographs from that first desperate winter camping in the abandoned building, he barely recognized the broken man and frightened child they'd been. The brickworks had transformed with them. What had been toxic abandonment was now thriving preservation, what had been decay was now purpose. The main kiln operated regularly, firing handmade bricks using methods Silas would have recognized, craftspeople from across the country coming to learn techniques most of the world had forgotten. The teaching workshops ran year-round, the building breathing with the sound of work and conversation, the smell of fired clay replacing the mildew and contamination that had poisoned the structure for decades. Owen had become the brickworks' youngest certified artisan brick maker at 17, tested by Sarah Martinez and a board of traditional craftspeople who'd evaluated his skills and found them exceptional. He'd developed an intuitive understanding of how clay responded to different firing temperatures, could read the quality of raw materials the way others read text. His bricks had been featured in restoration projects for historic buildings, his techniques studied by people trying to bridge traditional methods with modern sustainability. Nathan had found his own rhythm over those years. He managed the brickworks operations, handled the business side that allowed them to run sustainably while keeping fees accessible for students who couldn't afford expensive tuition. His back still troubled him on cold mornings, a permanent reminder of the injury that had destroyed his construction career. But the pain felt different now, not a symbol of loss but a marker of journey traveled. The remainder of Silas's gold had been invested carefully. Some went to establishing a scholarship fund for traditional craft education, ensuring that students like the person he'd been, broke and desperate, could still learn skills that mattered. Some went to maintaining the building properly, preventing the kind of neglect that had nearly destroyed it. The rest sat invested conservatively, providing security without extravagance, allowing them to make decisions based on principles rather than financial pressure. On a warm evening in late May, 15 years after Nathan had bought the brickworks at auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Redfield Memorial Gathering, a day when the brickworks opened to the community, when craftspeople demonstrated traditional techniques, when the building celebrated not just its survival but its rebirth as something Silas would have valued and understood. Charles Wickham attended, as he had for the past 7 years, his presence no longer uncomfortable but accepted. He was older now, fully retired, having handed his business operations to Emily, who'd proven more interested in historic preservation than development after seeing what Nathan had built. Silas would have appreciated this, Charles said, watching Owen teach a group of students how to evaluate clay consistency. Not because you're making money from it, but because you're keeping something alive that should have died when he did. Nathan had learned over the years that Charles's obsession with the brickworks had been about more than land or profit. It had been about his father's failure, about inherited anger that had defined 3 generations of Wickham men. Breaking that cycle had freed something in Charles, had allowed him to see the brickworks not as property stolen but as heritage preserved. "Your daughter seems genuinely passionate about what we're doing here," Nathan observed, watching Emily document the teaching process with professional equipment. "She's writing her doctoral thesis on industrial heritage preservation, how buildings like this represent cultural memory worth protecting. She interviewed me last year about my family's history with this place. First time I've talked honestly about the obsession that drove my father and grandfather. First time I've admitted we were wrong to fight Silas the way we did." After Charles moved on to examine other demonstrations, Vernon Bailey's grandson approached, carrying a box he'd promised to bring. Vernon had died 5 years ago, but his family had inherited his careful record-keeping and his commitment to preserving Ashton Grove's history. "Granddad left instructions that this should go to you after enough time had passed," Marcus said, handing Nathan the box. "He didn't specify how much time, just said you'd know when you were ready to understand what it contained." Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by Silas Redfield over the years to Vernon. Personal correspondence that revealed the man behind the exacting craftsman reputation, his struggles with watching his industry die, his determination to protect what he'd built even when protection meant hiding rather than using. Nathan read through them that evening after the gathering had ended, Owen reading over his shoulder, both of them learning more about the man whose hidden fortune had changed their lives. Silas had been lonely, had poured his life into his craft at the expense of personal relationships, had died alone because he'd never learned to value people the way he'd valued quality work. One letter, dated just weeks before his death, carried particular weight. "Vernon, I'm preparing to seal the chamber tomorrow. Everything is ready, the gold secured, the safe installed, the clues arranged for whoever might be clever enough to find them. I tell myself this is about protecting assets from those who'd misuse them, but truthfully, it's about legacy. I'm dying slowly, my craft dying with me, and I can't bear the thought that it will all just disappear as if it never mattered. The gold is my final act of faith, faith that someone will come along who understands that some things are worth preserving even when the world has moved on. If you're reading this after my death and no one has found the chamber, perhaps my faith was misplaced. But I had to try. I had to believe that craftsmanship and quality and careful work still matter to someone, somewhere." Owen set down the letter, his expression thoughtful. "He died believing his work might not matter to anyone. That's really sad." "But he was wrong," Nathan said. "His work mattered to Vernon, who learned from him and remembered. It matters to Sarah and to you and to the students who come here. It matters to a whole community of craftspeople who are keeping traditional methods alive. Because we found his gold and used it the way he hoped we would." "No," Nathan corrected gently. "Because Silas built something solid enough to survive 40 years of abandonment, because he left clues that preserved the possibility of resurrection, because he had faith that someone would understand what was worth saving. The gold helped, but the real inheritance was the building itself and what it represented." The following year brought changes that felt like completion of cycles that had started before Nathan arrived. Sarah Martinez decided to semi-retire from active teaching, though she remained as an advisor and occasional instructor. She recommended Owen to take over the master brickmaker position, to become the lead educator for the program they'd built together. "You've learned everything I could teach you," Sarah said during the formal transition. "More importantly, you understand why it matters. Silas died without passing on his knowledge, let his skills die with him. You won't make that mistake." Emily Wickham's dissertation was published that spring, a thoughtful examination of how small-town industrial buildings represented more than just economics, how they held stories and knowledge and community identity that deserved preservation. The chapter about the brickworks was honest about her family's decades-long attempt to acquire it, frank about the obsession that had driven 3 generations to fight over land they'd convinced themselves should have been theirs. "My grandfather believed Silas Redfield cheated his family out of a legitimate business opportunity," Emily wrote. "My father inherited that belief, and I grew up hearing it as established fact. But researching this project forced me to examine what evidence actually existed versus what we'd convinced ourselves to believe. The truth is that Silas built something of value through honest work, and my family spent generations trying to take it rather than building something of their own. The publication created conversations in Ashton Grove about other buildings that might be worth preserving, other histories that deserved documentation before they were lost entirely. Emily established a nonprofit focused on industrial heritage preservation, using proceeds from her book to fund projects throughout the region. Nathan found himself serving on the nonprofit's board, alongside Charles Wickham in what would have seemed impossible 15 years earlier, working together to preserve rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "We wasted so much time fighting," Charles said during one board meeting, discussing a shuttered pottery works that showed promise for adaptive reuse. "Time we could have spent doing this kind of work, creating value instead of trying to steal it from others." On a cool October morning, 20 years after Nathan had arrived in Ashton Grove with Owen and nothing else, they received a visit from someone unexpected. His ex-wife Rebecca appeared at the brickworks entrance, older and carrying herself with the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. Owen saw her first, his expression going carefully neutral in the way it did when he was processing complicated emotions. "Mom's here." Nathan joined his son at the window, seeing the woman who'd left them when things got hard, who'd taken their daughter Emma but left Owen because she'd said she could only handle saving one of them. He felt Owen tense beside him, waiting to see how he'd respond, whether he'd turn away the mother who'd abandoned him or whether he'd demonstrate the kind of grace Silas Redfield had never managed to show in his own relationships. "Let's hear what she has to say," Nathan said quietly. They met Rebecca in the brickworks' small office, the space Nathan had built from the room where Silas once managed his dying business. Rebecca looked around with evident surprise at the transformation, at the thriving operation that had grown from the desperate gamble Nathan had made with his last dollars. "I've been following your success," Rebecca said, her voice carrying genuine admiration mixed with what might have been regret. The articles about the brickworks restoration, Emily Wickham's dissertation, the craft journals featuring Owen's work. "You built something remarkable from nothing." "We built it from desperation," Nathan corrected. "And from a dead man's hidden fortune. And from refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier." Rebecca flinched slightly at the implied criticism, but she nodded. "I came to apologize. Not to ask for anything or to try to be part of this, just to say I was wrong. I left when you needed me most, convinced myself that walking away was self-preservation when really it was just cowardice." She turned to Owen. "You were 8 years old, and I abandoned you because I couldn't handle the stress of your father's struggles. That was unforgivable, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to say it, needed you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." Owen was quiet for a long moment, his face showing the kind of careful control he'd learned from years of managing difficult emotions. Finally, he said, "You leaving taught me something important. It taught me that some people quit when things get hard, and other people stand their ground. Dad stood, and I learned to stand by watching him. So maybe your leaving was a gift in a way you didn't intend." The words were gentle but firm, accepting the apology without absolving the abandonment. Rebecca nodded, tears in her eyes, understanding that some things couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged. After she left, Nathan and Owen stood together in the office that had once been Silas's, looking out at the brickworks floor where students were learning traditional methods, where knowledge was being preserved and passed forward. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since Silas's death, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. "Do you think we'll ever see her again?" Owen asked. "I don't know. Maybe. But it doesn't matter as much as it would have once. We've built something here that doesn't depend on her or anyone else. That's what Silas taught us, that legacy isn't about perfect families or unbroken lines, it's about building something solid enough to survive the people who create it." The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the brickwork story. Students who'd learned traditional brickmaking there established their own operations, creating a network of craftspeople who valued sustainable methods and quality materials. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Silas's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The gold had long since been fully spent or invested, its direct impact transformed into infrastructure and programs and scholarships that would outlive the physical metal. But its true value had never been the bars themselves, it had been the breathing room it provided, the space to build something meaningful rather than just survive. Nathan turned 50 at the brickworks, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the building's resurrection. Former students and current teachers, community members who'd watched the transformation, even Charles and Emily Wickham who'd made peace with history they couldn't change. The celebration felt less like a birthday party and more like acknowledgement of journey completed, of ground held through stubbornness and grace. Owen gave him a gift that day that made his throat tight, a brick he'd made himself using techniques Silas would have recognized, stamped with the Redfield mark and dated 2034. For the man who taught me that standing for something matters more than comfort, and that the best inheritance isn't what you receive but what you choose to build. As evening settled over Ashton Grove and the celebration wound down, Nathan walked alone through the brickworks' main floor, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had once been abandoned but now pulsed with purpose. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about a hidden chamber and a dead man's trust, about choices made and ground held. The building had been waiting, Silas's faith extending beyond death, the hidden fortune patient as only buried things can be. Nathan had found it at his lowest moment, had chosen to honor the trust it represented, had built something that transformed personal salvation into community resource. That was legacy in its truest form, not hoarding what you'd been given but investing it in something larger, not protecting heritage by sealing it away but by keeping it alive through practice and teaching. Silas had made the mistake of dying alone with his knowledge, but his hidden gold had funded the correction of that mistake, had created a place where skills were shared and preserved and passed forward. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before the brickworks was built, before Silas Redfield had worked his final shift, before Nathan had placed his desperate bid, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved and families choosing to build rather than destroy. The brickwork stood in the darkness, its windows glowing warm with security lights, its walls holding stories that spanned generations. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through desperation meeting opportunity, through stubbornness meeting grace, through one man's hidden fortune meeting another man's willingness to honor the trust it represented. Nathan locked the building for the night and walked to the house he'd built beside it, modest but solid, with Owen's workshop attached and students' quarters in the converted storage structure. The property hummed with quiet activity even in evening stillness, alive in ways that honored Silas's vision while serving needs he couldn't have anticipated. The land kept its secrets still, the creek flowing past as it had for millennia, the willow tree standing where Silas had buried his key, the clay deposits that had fed the brickworks for 90 years. But it had given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful, the chance to honor a trust placed in whoever was desperate enough and thorough enough to find what had been hidden. Silas Redfield had died protecting his life's work, had hidden his fortune as a final act of faith that someone would come along who'd understand what was worth saving. That someone had been Nathan, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen the easier path of taking gold and walking away. But he'd listened to a dead man's trust, had honored principles about craft and quality and refusing to surrender when powerful people demanded it. The brickworks would stand long after Nathan was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and clay, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear, in the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. Owen would carry it forward, and his students after him, creating continuity that turned accident into intention, desperation into purpose, one man's hidden treasure into a community's living heritage. The gold had been spent wisely, invested in preservation and teaching, used better than Silas had managed because Nathan had understood what Silas had missed, that knowledge hoarded dies, but knowledge shared multiplies across generations. As Nathan stood on his porch watching the brickwork silhouette against the night sky, he felt the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, but closure on the journey that had started with $17 and an eviction notice and had led to this moment of quiet triumph. The building breathed in the darkness, its purpose renewed, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its spaces filled with people learning and teaching and preserving what deserved preservation. Silas's faith had been rewarded, his fortune used exactly as he'd hoped, his building saved from the demolition he'd feared more than death. That was the real treasure, not the gold itself but what it had made possible, not the inheritance received but the legacy built, not the desperate gamble but the patient work that followed. The land had held its secrets and then yielded them to someone worthy, and Nathan had proven worthy not by finding them but by honoring the trust they represented. The brickwork stood as proof that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes broken people stumbling into good fortune used it to build something that mattered beyond their own salvation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.